Elijah Carter adjusted the strap of his duffel bag as he made his way through the crowded airport terminal. The weight of it was familiar, grounding him even as the chaotic energy of the airport buzzed around him. People rushed past, lost in their own worlds, some focused on their phones, others navigating luggage carts and trying to keep up with their families. Elijah was in no rush. After months overseas, he had learned patience. Each deployment had tested him in ways he never anticipated, but he had made it back. Now, the only thing that mattered was getting home. His body ached from the long journey, his muscles stiff from weeks of carrying his gear through unforgiving terrain. But none of that compared to the anticipation building in his chest at the thought of seeing his wife and daughter again. In his hand, he clutched his first-class ticket. A small indulgence, one he had debated for days before finally deciding he had earned it. He had spent years sacrificing, putting his life on the line, enduring conditions most people couldn't even imagine. If one comfortable flight was the price of that, he figured it was a fair trade. His wife, Naomi, had insisted. "You deserve this, Eli," she had told him over the phone when he mentioned his hesitation. "For once, put yourself first." He had chuckled at her words, knowing that would never come naturally to him, but he had agreed. And now, here he was, making his way toward the boarding gate, feeling the smallest bit of relief that soon, this journey would be over. As he approached the first-class lounge, he scanned the room. It was filled with business travelers, people dressed in expensive suits, sipping cocktails, or typing furiously on their laptops. There were a few elderly couples, casually dressed but carrying an air of quiet wealth. His own presence, in his neatly pressed military uniform, seemed to draw subtle glances. He had long since grown accustomed to the attention, though he never sought it. Some people offered him polite nods of appreciation, others simply looked, assessing him, perhaps wondering what a man like him was doing in a place like this. One person in particular stood out. Seated near the large window was a woman who looked as though she belonged in a glossy magazine advertisement rather than an airport lounge. Olivia Langford. She was dressed immaculately, her tailored blazer and designer shoes exuding wealth and sophistication. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection, her manicured fingers idly scrolling through her phone as if the world outside her screen barely existed. Her handbag, no doubt worth more than some people's monthly rent, sat on the seat beside her, staking claim to the space around her as if she owned it. Elijah paid her little mind. He was more focused on getting through this last leg of his journey in peace. He found his seat number and approached, nodding politely as he placed his bag in the overhead compartment. When he turned back, Olivia was watching him, her expression unreadable at first. Then her brows furrowed slightly, and her lips pressed into a thin line. It was a small thing, a subtle shift in demeanor, but Elijah recognized it instantly. That flicker of disbelief, the way her gaze briefly darted toward the empty seat next to her before returning to him as if she expected him to correct his mistake. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but edged with something colder. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Elijah met her gaze evenly, keeping his tone neutral. "Yes, I am." Olivia gave a small, skeptical laugh, shaking her head slightly. "Oh, it's just unexpected," she murmured, almost to herself. She glanced at the boarding pass in his hand, then back at his uniform, as if trying to reconcile the two. "You must have used points or something," she said, her voice casual, but the implication clear. Elijah felt his patience thin. He had been here before, in a dozen different ways, in 100 different places. He knew the coded language, the veiled disbelief. It was always the same. A black man in a space some people believed he didn't belong in. He could feel the weight of her assumption hanging in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Before he could respond, the flight attendant appeared, a warm smile on her face. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Elijah shook his head. "I'm good, thank you." The flight attendant nodded and turned to Olivia, who seemed slightly taken aback by the familiarity with which the attendant had addressed him. "Would you like anything, Olivia hesitated, then waved a dismissive hand. "No, I'm fine," she said, her voice quieter now. As the flight prepared for departure, Elijah settled into his seat, determined to ignore whatever quiet judgments Olivia was making beside him. But he could feel it, the stiffness in her posture, the way she shifted slightly away from him, the occasional glance in his direction as if she was still trying to make sense of his presence. He sighed, closing his eyes briefly. He had faced worse than an entitled woman with misplaced arrogance. He wasn't about to let her ruin the flight. As the plane took off, Olivia remained quiet, but her displeasure was evident in the way she adjusted herself, as if sharing space with Elijah was an inconvenience. He ignored her, keeping his focus on the thought of home. But just when he thought she might let it go, she spoke again. "I just assumed first class would be, different," she mused, her tone light but carrying an unmistakable sharpness. Elijah exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. "Different how?" he asked, turning to look at her. Olivia hesitated for just a second, but then gave a small, insincere smile. "Oh, business executives, CEOs, politicians." Elijah let the words sit between them, giving her the opportunity to realize the weight of what she was saying. But she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she didn't care. "Right," he said simply, turning back toward the window. The tension between them remained, unspoken but thick enough to feel. What neither of them realized, however, was that their exchange had not gone unnoticed. A few rows behind them, Benjamin Hayes had been watching the entire thing. A man who had built his success from the ground up, he had seen these interactions far too many times before. He had seen men like Elijah, men who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition, get dismissed, belittled, their achievements questioned simply because of how they looked. Benjamin leaned back in his seat, fingers tapping lightly against his armrest as he observed the silent war playing out in front of him. He wasn't the type to let things go unanswered. And though he hadn't planned on intervening, something about Elijah's quiet composure, the way he held himself with dignity despite the veiled hostility being thrown his way, made Benjamin decide that this was one of those moments where action mattered. He didn't say anything yet. But he would. And when he did, Olivia Langford was going to learn a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. Elijah Carter kept his focus on the window, watching the city lights disappear as the plane climbed higher into the night sky. He had promised himself that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ruin this flight. After everything he had been through overseas, after all the sacrifices he had made, he had earned this moment of peace. But peace, it seemed, was too much to ask for when people like Olivia Langford existed in the world. Beside him, Olivia sat stiffly, her posture straight, her lips pursed in disapproval. She hadn't spoken another word since her last veiled remark, but her body language spoke volumes. Every shift, every sigh, every glance in his direction was filled with an unspoken irritation. Elijah had encountered women like her before, entitled, insulated, convinced that their world should remain unchallenged by those they deemed unworthy. It was almost amusing how deeply some people clung to their prejudices. Almost. A flight attendant passed through the aisle, offering drinks to the passengers. When she reached Elijah, she smiled warmly. "Would you like anything to drink, Mr. Carter? We have champagne, wine, whiskey, or soft drinks." Before Elijah could respond, Olivia gave a small, scoffing sound. "Whiskey, really?" she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing between them as if sensing the tension. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Olivia's pettiness get to him. Instead, he met the flight attendant's gaze and gave her an easy smile. "Water's fine, thank you." The attendant nodded, handing him a glass before turning to Olivia. "And for you, I'll have the champagne," Olivia said, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction, as if ordering an expensive drink somehow reinforced whatever status she believed she had over Elijah. Elijah took a slow sip of his water, letting the coolness settle in his chest. He knew what she was trying to do. It wasn't about the drink. It was about control, about making sure he understood that, in her mind, he didn't belong here. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. She was insignificant. Just another obstacle in a life full of them. The flight settled into a steady hum, the low murmur of passengers chatting or watching in-flight entertainment filling the cabin. Elijah leaned back, determined to let the exhaustion pull him under. But just as his eyes started to close, Olivia turned toward him slightly. "I just find it interesting," she mused, as if they were having a casual conversation. "How the world works these days. First class used to be about status. Now, I suppose anyone can sit here if they find a way." Elijah let out a slow breath, willing himself to ignore her. But she wasn't done. "Not that I'm saying you don't deserve to be here," she added, though the condescension in her tone made it clear that was exactly what she was saying. I just mean, it's surprising. You don't see many people like you in first class. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? About how things have changed. At that, Elijah finally turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. And how exactly have things changed, Ms. Langford? She blinked, caught off guard by his directness. Well, she said, shifting in her seat, it's just unusual, I suppose. I mean, I assume you're military, right? That's the only way. She stopped herself, her words hanging in the air. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. The only way, he repeated. Olivia's face reddened slightly, but she lifted her chin. You know what I mean. It's just different from how things used to be. Elijah studied her for a long moment, debating whether to say more. But he knew better. People like Olivia weren't interested in actual conversations. They weren't interested in learning, in understanding. They just wanted to reinforce the world as they saw it. You must be exhausted, he said instead, his tone light. It must be exhausting carrying all that privilege around all day. Olivia's mouth snapped shut, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me? Elijah smiled, taking another sip of his water. Nothing. Just making an observation. A quiet chuckle came from a few rows behind them. Olivia stiffened, realizing someone had been listening. She glanced over her shoulder but quickly turned back when she saw Benjamin Hayes watching with mild amusement. Benjamin had been following the exchange since the moment it started, and he had heard enough. He leaned forward slightly, his deep voice cutting through the tension. Funny thing about first class, he said, addressing no one in particular but making sure his words landed exactly where they needed to. It doesn't care about skin color. Just money. Olivia's shoulders tensed, but she said nothing. Benjamin smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. Elijah turned his head slightly, offering a small nod of acknowledgement to the older man. He didn't know who Benjamin was, but he appreciated the unspoken solidarity. Benjamin wasn't just any passenger. He was a self-made businessman, one of the top investors in the country, though he preferred to keep a low profile. He had built his empire from the ground up, facing his own share of discrimination along the way. He had learned early on that people like Olivia existed in every corner of the world, always watching, always waiting to remind you that you didn't belong in their space. But he had also learned that the best response wasn't anger. It was success. Success, and the ability to turn the tables when the moment was right. Elijah, seemingly unfazed, adjusted his seat and closed his eyes again. He wasn't going to let Olivia Langford rob him of any more peace. The flight continued in silence for a while, but Olivia's irritation was palpable. She hated being put in her place, hated being challenged in a space where she was used to holding the upper hand. When the flight attendant returned to collect empty glasses, Olivia forced a smile. I'd like another champagne, please. The flight attendant hesitated. Actually, we're limiting alcohol to 2 drinks per passenger tonight. Would you like something else? Olivia's eyes flared. Excuse me? I am a first-class passenger. Yes, the attendant replied, her tone unfazed. But it's company policy for tonight's flight. Elijah bit back a smirk. Olivia fumed silently but said nothing, knowing she was losing this battle from every angle. Instead, she turned her body away from Elijah and faced the aisle, her posture stiff with indignation. Benjamin chuckled quietly again, shaking his head as he leaned back in his own seat. He had seen people like her fold under pressure before, but watching it play out in real time never got old. Elijah, meanwhile, finally allowed himself to relax. He had more important things to think about. In a few hours, he would be home. In a few hours, he would see Naomi and his daughter. That was the only thing that mattered. And as for Olivia Langford? She was already fading from his mind, insignificant. Just another reminder of the world he had spent his entire life pushing against. But he had made it this far. And nothing, not her words, not her privilege, not her presence, would ever change that. Elijah Carter kept his breathing steady, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest as he willed himself to stay calm. The encounter with Olivia Langford had been nothing more than an annoyance, a momentary brush with the kind of entitlement he had learned to ignore over the years. He had survived war zones, lost friends in battle, and endured sleepless nights wondering if he'd ever make it home. A condescending woman in first class wasn't about to shake him. The flight continued in uneasy silence. Olivia had turned away from him completely, her body angled toward the aisle as if that would erase the reality of his presence. He could feel her discomfort lingering between them, but he refused to give it power. Instead, he focused on the thought of home, of Naomi, of his little girl, of the life waiting for him after this flight. Benjamin Hayes watched it all unfold with quiet amusement. From his seat a few rows back, he had seen it all, the way Olivia's nose wrinkled when Elijah sat down, the way she clung to her illusion of superiority, and the way Elijah, with unshakable patience, had refused to give her the reaction she wanted. Benjamin had dealt with people like Olivia his whole life. He had built his empire in rooms where he wasn't welcome, shaking hands with men who had underestimated him before he proved them wrong. He admired Elijah's restraint, but he also saw an opportunity. Leaning slightly forward, Benjamin decided to stir the pot just a little. "So, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the low hum of the plane. "What line of work are you in?" Elijah glanced back, recognizing the man who had subtly defended him earlier. He wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but something in Benjamin's tone told him he wasn't looking for trouble. "Military," Elijah answered simply. "Just finished my last tour overseas." Benjamin nodded, as if he had already assumed as much. "Ah," he said. "Explains the discipline. You carry yourself like a man who's seen things." Elijah let out a small chuckle. "You could say that." Benjamin smiled, leaning back in his seat. "I respect that. I never served myself, but I have the highest regard for those who do. Takes a different kind of strength to go through what you've been through." Olivia let out a sharp breath through her nose, shifting in her seat. It was clear that the last thing she wanted was for Elijah to be praised, for someone to recognize his worth in a space she had tried to exclude him from. "Strength," she murmured under her breath, shaking her head slightly, "isn't just about where you've been. It's about where you belong." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward Olivia, catching the bitterness in her words. He had met women like her before, so convinced of their place in the world, so threatened by the idea that someone else might rise to meet them. He debated saying something, but Elijah beat him to it. "That's the thing about belonging," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not something anyone gets to decide for me." Olivia didn't respond. She merely exhaled sharply again, her irritation palpable. The flight continued, with attendants moving down the aisle offering meals. Elijah wasn't particularly hungry, but he accepted his tray, grateful for anything that might keep his mind occupied. He had planned to eat in peace, but Olivia, it seemed, wasn't quite finished. She turned toward him with a forced, polite smile. "So, tell me," she said, picking up her fork delicately. "How does someone in the military afford first class? You must be doing quite well for yourself." Elijah clenched his jaw, knowing exactly what she was implying. He took a slow sip of water before answering. "I saved up," he said simply. "Figured after everything, I deserved a little comfort on my way home." Olivia gave a small, unimpressed nod. "I suppose," she said, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "Though, I always thought first class was for," she hesitated, then forced a smile, "a different kind of traveler." Benjamin set his fork down, no longer entertained by Olivia's games. "And what kind of traveler is that, Ms. Langford?" he asked, his tone sharp. Olivia blinked, as if realizing too late that she was being backed into a corner. "Oh, you know," she said, waving a hand vaguely. "Business executives, investors, people who look like you." Benjamin finished for her, raising an eyebrow. Olivia's mouth snapped shut, her face flushing with embarrassment. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant," Benjamin countered, his voice cool. Elijah had to admit, he was enjoying watching Olivia struggle to regain control of the conversation. He wasn't one for confrontations, but there was something satisfying about seeing someone like Benjamin, a man with power and influence, hold her accountable. "Tell me something," Benjamin continued, folding his hands on the tray table. "If Mr. Carter were wearing a suit instead of a uniform, would you have questioned his seat? If he had walked in here with a briefcase instead of a duffel bag, would you have assumed he didn't belong?" Olivia let out a breathless, nervous laugh. This is ridiculous. I was just making conversation." "Conversation?" Benjamin mused. "Interesting. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like an interrogation." Elijah, though appreciative of Benjamin's defense, decided it was time to end this. He didn't need validation from anyone, not Benjamin, and certainly not Olivia. He turned to her, his voice steady. "You don't have to like that I'm here," he said. "You don't have to agree with it. But I earned my seat. Just like you earned yours, however that may have happened." Olivia stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She opened her mouth, as if ready to argue, but then thought better of it. Instead, she turned away once more, her posture rigid. Benjamin smirked. "Well said, Mr. Carter." Elijah sighed, pushing his tray away. "I'm just trying to get home." Benjamin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And where is home?" Elijah hesitated for a second before answering. "Atlanta. My wife and daughter are waiting for me." Benjamin's eyes softened slightly. "A good reason to fly first class," he said. "If there ever was one." Elijah chuckled, finally feeling the tension ease. He appreciated Benjamin's support, but more than that, he appreciated the reminder that not everyone in the world was like Olivia Langford. As the flight continued, Olivia remained silent, her posture stiff, her gaze locked on the window as if that would make everything disappear. She had lost this battle, and she knew it. Elijah, on the other hand, felt lighter. He had walked into this flight expecting nothing more than a quiet journey home. Instead, he had been reminded of the world he was returning to, a world that still had its prejudices, its barriers. But also a world where people like Benjamin existed. A world where dignity and patience could still win, even in the most unexpected places. And as he leaned back in his seat, letting the hum of the plane lull him into rest, he decided that was all that mattered. Elijah shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness that had settled in from sitting too long. The confrontation with Olivia had been exhausting in its own way, but he had long since learned to pick his battles. The woman had made it clear who she was, her prejudices weren't something he could change in one flight. And honestly, he had no interest in trying. His focus remained on getting home, on seeing Naomi and little Ava. The thought of his daughter running into his arms at the airport was the only thing keeping his patience intact. The last time he had seen her, she had been barely tall enough to wrap her arms around his leg. Now, she was growing so fast that he worried he was missing too much. That was the hardest part of his service, missing the little moments. Birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories. He had told himself that all his sacrifices were for his family's future, but now, as he was finally on his way home, he was more than ready to start being present for the moments he had lost. Benjamin glanced at Elijah as if sensing the shift in his thoughts. "You ever thought about what's next?" he asked. Elijah turned toward him, raising a brow. "What do you mean?" "After the military," Benjamin clarified, leaning back in his seat. "You got plans? Or are you just figuring it out as you go?" Elijah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Figuring it out," he admitted. "I know I don't want to go back to another deployment. But beyond that? Haven't really put much thought into it." Benjamin nodded slowly, studying him. "You've got leadership experience. Discipline. You know how to work under pressure. That's worth something." Elijah chuckled. "Worth something to who?" "To people like me," Benjamin said simply. "I run a foundation, part business, part non-profit. We work with veterans, helping them transition into careers that actually use the skills they developed in the service. A lot of guys get out and feel lost, like they don't have a place outside of the military. I try to change that." Elijah listened, intrigued but cautious. "And you think I'd be a good fit for something like that?" Benjamin shrugged. "I think you'd be good at anything you set your mind to. But I also think people like you get overlooked too often. You walk into a room, and half of them see the uniform, but they don't see the person. You sit in first class, and some folks assume you don't belong. Sound familiar?" Elijah smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, I might have run into that problem once or twice." "Exactly," Benjamin said. "And I like proving people like Olivia Langford wrong." Elijah chuckled at that, glancing over to see Olivia still facing the window, pretending she wasn't listening to their conversation when it was obvious she had been. Benjamin leaned in slightly. "Come by the office when you're settled. No pressure, no commitments. Just a conversation." Elijah nodded, considering it. "I'll think about it." Benjamin grinned. "That's all I ask." The rest of the flight passed without further incident, and for that, Elijah was grateful. He dozed off for a while, exhaustion finally winning over. When he woke, the flight attendants were making their rounds, preparing the passengers for landing. Olivia hadn't spoken another word to him, which suited him just fine. As the plane began its descent, Elijah's heart picked up speed. The closer they got to home, the more real everything felt. His fingers curled around the armrest as he watched the city lights below come into view, sprawling like veins of gold across the dark landscape. Home. It was finally within reach. The wheels hit the runway with a soft jolt, and a wave of relief washed over him. He was here. The flight attendants gave their usual reminders about seatbelts and disembarking in an orderly fashion, but Elijah barely heard them. His mind was already a few steps ahead, picturing the moment he would step out of the terminal and see Naomi and Ava waiting for him. The plane taxied to a stop, and passengers began gathering their belongings, the quiet hum of the cabin replaced by the rustling of carry-ons and murmured conversations. Olivia was quick to stand, gathering her designer purse and moving toward the aisle as if she couldn't get away fast enough. Elijah took his time, unhurried. He had nothing to prove to her. Benjamin clapped him on the shoulder. "Good luck, Carter." Elijah nodded. "You too, Hayes." Benjamin handed him a business card. "If you decide you want to talk, give me a call." Elijah slipped it into his pocket without a word. The first-class passengers began disembarking, and as Elijah stepped into the terminal, his eyes immediately scanned the crowd. His heart pounded in his chest. And then he saw them. Naomi was standing near the barrier, her dark curls bouncing as she stretched onto her toes, searching for him. And beside her, little Ava clung to her mother's hand, her face lighting up the moment she spotted him. "Daddy!" she shrieked. Elijah barely had time to drop his bag before she barreled into him, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. He lifted her with ease, holding her as close as he could. "Hey, princess," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Naomi stepped forward, smiling through teary eyes. "You're home." "I'm home," Elijah confirmed. She reached for him, and he pulled her into the embrace, the three of them holding onto each other in the middle of the bustling terminal. The weight of months apart, of everything he had endured, melted away in that single moment. This was what mattered. This was what he had fought for. After a long while, Naomi pulled back just enough to look at him. "How was your flight?" Elijah let out a breath, shaking his head. "Long?" She smirked, her eyes full of knowing. "Trouble?" Elijah glanced toward the exit where Olivia was striding through the terminal, her nose in the air as if she hadn't just been humiliated in front of an entire first-class cabin. He chuckled. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Naomi arched a brow, but she didn't push for more details. Instead, she took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Let's get you home." Elijah nodded. Home. As they made their way toward the exit, he felt the weight of the past months slip off his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, whether he'd take Benjamin up on his offer or chart his own path. But for now, he was exactly where he was meant to be. With his family. Finally home. Elijah settled into the passenger seat as Naomi drove through the familiar streets of their city, the glow of streetlights flickering across his face. The hum of the engine mixed with Ava's soft breathing in the backseat, her little head resting against her car seat. She had fallen asleep moments after they left the airport, her tiny hand clutching the sleeve of his jacket, as if afraid he'd disappear again. Naomi reached over, lacing her fingers through his as she glanced at him briefly. "You okay?" Elijah exhaled, his thumb grazing over her knuckles. "Yeah. Just processing." Naomi gave a knowing nod. "It's weird being back, isn't it?" He sighed. "Yeah." He had spent months counting down to this moment, picturing it 100 different ways, but now that he was here, it felt surreal. The transition from war zones and military bases to the quiet of home always left him feeling slightly off balance, like he was standing between two worlds, unsure of where he fit. Naomi seemed to sense it, as she always did. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight," she said softly. "Just breathe, You're home." Home. The words settled over him, grounding him. He turned his head, watching Naomi as she focused on the road, her features illuminated by the dashboard lights. God, he had missed her. Missed the way she smelled like vanilla and jasmine, missed the way her presence alone could soothe the chaos in his mind. He squeezed her hand. "How have you been?" She let out a soft laugh. "Busy. Ava's been a handful, work has been crazy, and I've been running on coffee and prayers." Elijah chuckled. Sounds about right. But we managed, she continued, a slight teasing lilt in her voice. Though Ava did try to negotiate her way into getting ice cream for breakfast 3 days in a row. He smirked. Did she succeed? Naomi rolled her eyes. Once. Elijah laughed, shaking his head. That's my girl. She's been talking about you non-stop, Naomi said, her voice growing softer. She has a countdown chart in her room, and every night before bed, she'd say, 1 more sleep till Daddy comes home. His throat tightened. I hate that I miss so much. Naomi gave his hand another squeeze. You're here now. That's what matters. They pulled up to their house a few minutes later, and Elijah took a moment to just look at it. The porch light cast a warm glow over the front yard, the same old swing set standing in the corner where Ava loved to play. It was everything he had dreamed of while he was away, everything that had kept him going on the hardest nights. As soon as they stepped inside, the familiar scent of home washed over him, Naomi's lavender candles, a faint trace of Ava's bubblegum-scented shampoo, and something warm lingering from dinner. He dropped his duffel bag by the door, stretching out his stiff muscles. Naomi yawned. I should put Ava to bed. I'll do it, Elijah said, stepping toward the car seat. He carefully unbuckled Ava, lifting her into his arms. She stirred slightly, her tiny face scrunching up before she nestled into his shoulder. Naomi smiled, watching them. She's been waiting for this. Elijah swallowed past the lump in his throat as he carried his daughter to her room. The small nightlight cast a soft glow across the walls, where crayon drawings and stars covered the space. He laid Ava down gently, tucking the blankets around her. As he started to pull away, her little hand shot out, grabbing his fingers. Daddy? I'm here, baby girl, he whispered, smoothing her curls. Ava blinked up at him sleepily. You're not leaving? No, he promised. I'm staying right here. She gave a small smile before drifting back to sleep, her grip loosening but never fully letting go. Elijah sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, just watching her, his heart aching with love and guilt all at once. He had missed too much, but he wouldn't miss any more. When he finally returned to their bedroom, Naomi was already curled up under the covers, watching him with tired but happy eyes. He climbed into bed beside her, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her close. She sighed against his chest. I missed this. Me too, he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. More than you know. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the city outside. Elijah traced slow circles on Naomi's back, his mind drifting. The tension from the flight, from Olivia's judgment, still lingered in the back of his mind, but here, in the warmth of their home, it felt smaller, less significant. Still, he thought about what Benjamin had said. About veterans being overlooked, about finding purpose beyond the military. It had stuck with him more than he wanted to admit. Naomi shifted slightly, tilting her head up to look at him. You're thinking. He huffed out a quiet laugh. You always know. Of course, she said, smirking. What is it? Elijah hesitated. Met someone on the flight. Naomi raised a brow. Not Olivia, I hope. He chuckled. No, not her. A guy named Benjamin Hayes. Runs a foundation for veterans. Helps them transition into careers that actually fit their skills. Naomi studied him for a moment. And he thinks I'd be a good fit. She reached up, brushing a thumb over his jaw. Do you? Elijah exhaled. I don't know. I hadn't really thought about what's next. But, he made some good points. Naomi smiled. You always said you wanted to do something that made a difference. He nodded, mulling it over. I don't want to jump into anything too fast. But maybe I'll hear him out. I think that's a good idea, Naomi said softly. You've given so much to your country, Maybe it's time to figure out what you want to give to yourself. He let that sink in, pressing another kiss to her forehead. We'll see, he murmured. But for now, I just want to be here. Naomi snuggled closer, resting her head against his chest. Then be here. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah let himself do just that. The next morning, Elijah woke to the warmth of sunlight streaming through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the bedroom. For a moment, he just lay there, soaking it all in. The quiet hum of the house, the scent of Naomi's shampoo lingering in the air, the gentle rise and fall of her breath beside him, it was everything he had longed for during those sleepless nights overseas. Carefully, he turned his head, watching Naomi as she slept, her curls spilling across the pillow. His chest tightened with gratitude. She had held everything together while he was gone, managing work, Ava, and the weight of his absence. He knew it hadn't been easy, and yet, she had never once complained. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face before placing a soft kiss on her forehead. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. What time is it?" she murmured sleepily. Elijah glanced at the clock. "Almost 7. Naomi groaned, burying her face back in the pillow. "Too early." He chuckled, shifting so he could prop himself up on his elbow. "You always get up early for work." "Yeah, but today's Saturday," she mumbled. "And you're home." That last part made his heart swell. He was home. For real this time. "Go back to sleep," he whispered, tucking the blankets around her. Naomi hummed in agreement, already drifting off again. Smiling, Elijah slipped out of bed and padded toward the door, deciding to check on Ava. Down the hall, her door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, he found her still curled up under her blankets, her tiny body rising and falling with each breath. A stuffed bunny was clutched in her arms, the same one she had slept with since she was a baby. He quietly walked over and sat on the edge of her bed, watching her, memorizing every detail. As if sensing him, Ava stirred, blinking sleepily before her gaze focused on him. Her face broke into a drowsy smile. "Daddy." "Hey, baby girl," he murmured, brushing his hand over her curls. She yawned, rubbing her eyes before pushing herself up and crawling into his lap, wrapping her little arms around his neck. He held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of baby lotion and sleep. "You're really here," she mumbled against his shoulder. "I'm really here," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. Ava leaned back, studying his face with a serious expression. "You're not gonna leave again?" Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. "Not for a long time," he promised. She seemed satisfied with that answer, resting her head back against him. They sat there for a long moment, just holding each other. Eventually, Ava pulled back and grinned. "Can we have pancakes?" Elijah laughed. "Of course." Ava scrambled off his lap, grabbing his hand and tugging him toward the kitchen. The house was quiet as they moved through it, the warmth of home settling around him like a comforting embrace. He had missed this, the simple joy of morning routines, of making breakfast with his daughter, of just existing in the space they had built together. In the kitchen, he lifted Ava onto the counter, letting her swing her little legs as he gathered ingredients. She watched him with wide, curious eyes. "Did you eat pancakes when you were away?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not like this. Mostly army food." Ava scrunched up her nose. "Did it taste bad?" He chuckled. "Sometimes." She giggled. "Then I'll make you the best pancakes ever." He smiled as she eagerly reached for the flour, her small hands eager to help. They worked together, Ava mixing the batter while he handled the stove. She chatted away, telling him all about school, her favorite cartoons, and the new friends she had made. Elijah listened intently, hanging on to every word. By the time the pancakes were done, Naomi had finally dragged herself out of bed, yawning as she walked into the kitchen. She leaned against the doorway, watching them with a soft smile. "You two having fun?" "Daddy made pancakes," Ava announced proudly. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And did you help?" "I mixed," Ava said, beaming. Naomi chuckled, walking over to press a kiss to Elijah's cheek. "Good to see you settling back in." He nodded, handing her a plate. "Feels good." They sat at the table, eating together, the conversation flowing easily. Elijah felt a sense of peace wash over him, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past year. This was what he had fought for, what had kept him going. And now that he was here, he wasn't going to take a single moment for granted. After breakfast, Naomi got Ava ready for a playdate with her friend's family. As they packed up Ava's things, Naomi glanced at Elijah. "You have any plans today?" He hesitated. "I was thinking about calling Benjamin." Naomi's expression softened. "You're really considering it?" Elijah exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. But I figure it wouldn't hurt to hear more." She nodded in encouragement. "I think that's a good idea." Ava ran up, wrapping her arms around his legs. "Bye, Daddy." He knelt down, hugging her tightly. "Have fun, baby girl." She giggled, planting a sloppy kiss on his cheek before skipping to the door. Naomi shot him one last smile before heading out with Ava, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts. Sighing, he grabbed his phone and scrolled to Benjamin's contact. He hesitated for a moment before finally pressing dial. It rang twice before Benjamin picked up. "Elijah," he greeted warmly. "Was wondering if you'd call." Elijah chuckled. "Yeah, sorry for the delay. I've just been getting settled." "No need to apologize," Benjamin said. "Adjusting after deployment takes time." Elijah appreciated the understanding. "I wanted to hear more about what you do. You mentioned helping vets transition?" "Yeah," Benjamin said. "We run programs that help veterans find careers that actually use their skills. We also provide mentorship, job placement, and business grants for those looking to start their own thing." Elijah nodded, intrigued. "That sounds useful." "It is," Benjamin agreed. "A lot of guys come back and feel lost. They don't know how to take the skills they learned in the military and apply them to civilian life. We help bridge that gap." Elijah leaned against the counter, considering. "And you think I'd be a good fit for this?" "I do," Benjamin said. "You've got leadership experience, discipline, and you know what it's like to be in their shoes. You could help a lot of people." Elijah was quiet for a moment. The idea of stepping into something new felt daunting, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this could be something worthwhile. "Why don't you come by the office on Monday?" Benjamin suggested. "No pressure, just take a look." Elijah took a deep breath. "All right, I'll be there." As he hung up, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This wasn't what he had planned for his future, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed. He glanced out the window, watching as the city moved outside, people going about their day. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had options. Like he wasn't just returning home, he was stepping into something new. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. Elijah spent the rest of the day thinking about his conversation with Benjamin. He hadn't expected to seriously consider stepping into a new role so soon after coming home, but the idea lingered in his mind. It wasn't just about having something to do, it was about purpose. He had spent so many years knowing exactly what his role was, what his mission was. Now, as a civilian, everything felt open-ended. And maybe that was part of what made the transition difficult. He was still deep in thought when Naomi returned with Ava later that evening. Ava came bursting through the door first, her little feet pounding against the hardwood floors. "Daddy, guess what?" Elijah crouched down, catching her as she ran into his arms. "What, baby girl?" She grinned, her dimples showing. "We went to the park, and I climbed all the way up the big slide by myself. Mommy said I was super brave." Elijah smiled, brushing a curl from her face. "I bet you were." Naomi walked in behind her, setting down Ava's backpack by the door. She glanced at Elijah, noticing the distant look in his eyes. "Everything okay?" He hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. Just been thinking." She tilted her head slightly. "About what?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Benjamin's offer. I told him I'd stop by on Monday." Naomi's expression softened, and she moved closer, wrapping her arms around his waist. "That's great, Eli. I know you're not sure about it yet, but it's a step in the right direction." He let out a small chuckle, leaning his forehead against hers. "You always know what to say, don't you?" She smiled. "I try." That night, Elijah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Naomi slept beside him. He wasn't sure why he felt so unsettled. Maybe it was the idea of stepping into something new, or maybe it was the fear that he wouldn't fit in outside of the military. But he knew one thing, doing nothing wasn't an option. When Monday morning arrived, Elijah got dressed, pulling on a simple button-up and jeans, something he hadn't worn in a long time. Civilian clothes still felt strange after years of wearing a uniform, but he was trying. He kissed Naomi goodbye, ruffled Ava's curls, and headed out, his nerves creeping in as he drove toward the address Benjamin had given him. The office wasn't anything flashy. It was a modest two-story building, but the moment Elijah stepped inside, he could feel a sense of community. The walls were lined with photos, some of veterans in uniform, others of them with their families, smiling, thriving. A few people sat at desks, talking, laughing, working. It didn't feel like an office. It felt like a space where people understood each other. Benjamin spotted him immediately, walking over with a grin. "Glad you came." Elijah shook his hand, nodding. Figured it was worth checking out. Benjamin led him toward a small conference room, motioning for him to sit. I won't take up too much of your time, he said. I just want to show you what we do here, and if it feels right, we'll go from there. Elijah listened as Benjamin explained their programs, mentorship, career placement, even small business funding for veterans who wanted to start something of their own. What we do here isn't just about finding people jobs, Benjamin said. It's about giving them a new sense of purpose. You know as well as I do that coming home doesn't mean the mission is over. It just changes. Elijah nodded slowly. He understood that all too well. Benjamin leaned forward, watching him carefully. So, what do you think? Elijah exhaled. I don't know if I'm ready to commit to anything full-time, but I want to help. I want to do something that matters. Benjamin grinned. That's all I needed to hear. Over the next few hours, Elijah met with other veterans who worked at the organization, listening to their stories. Some had struggled more than others, but all of them had found something here, a place to land, a new sense of direction. By the time he left, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He drove home with a clearer mind, feeling lighter than he had in months. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Naomi standing on the porch, her arms crossed as she watched him with a knowing smile. How'd it go? She asked as he stepped out of the car. He let out a deep breath, walking up to her. It went, good. Her smile widened. Yeah, he admitted, pulling her into a hug. I think I might have found something worth doing. Naomi wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. I knew you would. Inside, Ava was waiting for him, already bouncing on the couch. Did you get a new job, Daddy? Elijah chuckled, scooping her up into his arms. Something like that, baby girl. She beamed. Does that mean we can still have pancake mornings? He laughed, nodding. Always. As the evening settled in and Elijah sat with his family, he realized something. For the first time since coming home, he wasn't just waiting to adjust. He was moving forward. And that was everything. Elijah adjusted quickly to his new role at the organization, though he kept his commitment flexible, easing into the transition of working again. At first, he simply observed, listening to the veterans who came through the doors, hearing their stories, their struggles, their frustrations. He realized that a lot of what they were facing were things he had felt himself. The uncertainty, the loss of identity, the constant feeling of being in survival mode even when there was no battlefield around them. Benjamin was patient with him, giving him the space to find his footing. You don't have to have all the answers, he told Elijah one day after a particularly heavy conversation with a struggling veteran. Sometimes, people just need to be heard. Elijah thought about that for a long time. He had always been a man of action, someone who solved problems rather than just listened to them. But he was learning that not everything needed fixing. Some things just needed understanding. One afternoon, he sat across from a young man named Daniel, who had only been out of the service for a few months and was already struggling to adapt. He had lost his job due to an outburst with a supervisor, and his marriage was crumbling under the weight of his unspoken frustrations. I don't even know who I am anymore, Daniel admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. I wake up, and it's like I don't recognize the person in the mirror. My wife keeps asking what's wrong, and I don't even know how to explain it to her. Elijah leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. You're not alone in that, he said. A lot of us go through it. When you spend so much time with a mission, a purpose, and suddenly it's gone, it's like losing a part of yourself. Daniel looked up, something shifting in his expression. That's exactly what it feels like. Elijah nodded. But here's the thing, it doesn't mean you have to stay lost. You have to rebuild. Redefine who you are outside of the uniform. Daniel let out a breath, nodding slowly. I just don't know where to start. You start by taking one step, Elijah said simply. One decision at a time. Maybe that means reaching out to your wife and letting her in, even if you don't have the words. Maybe it means coming here more often, talking it through instead of shutting down. But whatever you do, don't stop moving forward. For the first time since they had sat down, Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly. Thanks, man. I appreciate this. Elijah felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched Daniel leave the office that day. It wasn't a major breakthrough, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all someone needed. That evening, as he drove home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wasn't just existing anymore, he was making an impact. Even if it was just small moments, they mattered. Naomi noticed the change in him immediately when he walked through the door. "You're smiling," she observed with a soft grin, setting the dinner table. Elijah chuckled, pulling her into a hug. "Am I?" She looked up at him, searching his face. "It's been a while since I've seen you like this." He kissed her forehead. "I think I finally feel like I belong somewhere again." That night, as they lay in bed, Elijah found himself staring at the ceiling, his mind still processing everything. He thought about the men and women he had met at the organization, about Daniel's words, about his own struggles. He knew his journey was far from over. There would still be bad days, moments of doubt, times when he felt lost. But for the first time since coming home, he had something to hold on to. And that made all the difference. Elijah woke up earlier than usual, the quiet hum of the city barely filtering through the bedroom window. Naomi was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. For a moment, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the past few days settle in his chest. He had been moving forward, one step at a time, just like he had told Daniel. But there were moments, like this one, where the past still felt close enough to reach out and grab him. He carefully slipped out of bed and made his way to the kitchen, brewing himself a cup of coffee before stepping onto the small balcony. The cool morning air helped clear his mind. He took a sip, his thoughts wandering back to his work at the organization. It had only been a few weeks, but it already felt like something he was meant to be part of. His phone buzzed in his pocket. When he checked the screen, he saw a message from Benjamin. "Need you at the office early. Got something important to discuss." Elijah frowned slightly but responded quickly. "I'll be there." By the time he arrived at the organization's headquarters, the sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow over the city. Inside, the office was already buzzing with activity. A few veterans were gathered in the common area, engaged in quiet conversations. Elijah nodded in greeting as he passed by, making his way to Benjamin's office. Benjamin was standing by the window, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming in early," he said as Elijah entered. "What's going on?" Elijah asked, closing the door behind him. Benjamin turned, his face serious. "We have a situation." Elijah's body tensed automatically, his instincts kicking in. "What kind of situation?" Benjamin walked over to his desk and grabbed a file, handing it to Elijah. "A donor we've been working with pulled out last minute. It was a big one, money that was supposed to go toward expanding our veteran support programs." Elijah flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening. "Why'd they pull out?" Benjamin hesitated before answering. "Because of you." Elijah's head snapped up. "What?" Benjamin sighed. "Apparently, word got around about the incident on the plane. One of the executives at the company that was funding us didn't like the attention you've been getting. They think it's controversial to have you as part of our leadership team." Elijah felt a slow burn rise in his chest. "Controversial? For what?" "Existing?" Benjamin's expression darkened. "That's what I said. But they don't want the heat. They're worried about potential backlash from certain investors, so they pulled out." Elijah clenched his fists. He had dealt with plenty of prejudice in his life, but something about this hit differently. It wasn't just about him. It was about the work they were doing, about the veterans who needed help. And now, because of someone's discomfort with his presence, resources were being stripped away from those who needed them most. "What do we do now?" he asked, forcing himself to stay calm. Benjamin leaned against the desk. "We find another way. I won't let this stop us, Elijah. And I know you won't either." Elijah took a deep breath, nodding. "We'll figure something out." Benjamin studied him for a moment. "You okay?" Elijah exhaled sharply. "I'm just tired, man. Tired of fighting battles that shouldn't even be battles in the first place." "I hear you," Benjamin said quietly. "But if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you don't back down." Elijah managed a small smirk. "Yeah, well, guess I don't have a choice." For the rest of the day, he threw himself into work, trying to channel his frustration into something productive. He met with other team members, strategizing on ways to make up for the lost funding. He reached out to potential new donors, though most responses were vague and non-committal. By evening, he was exhausted, but he wasn't ready to go home just yet. Instead, he found himself at the gym, pushing himself through a grueling workout. He needed to clear his head, to release the tension that had been building all day. As he finished his last set, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Naomi. "Hey, where are you?" He wiped sweat from his forehead before responding. "Gym. Just needed to clear my head." "Long day?" "Yeah." She didn't press for details, but she didn't need to. "Come home soon, okay?" He stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "I will." When he finally got home, Naomi was waiting for him, a warm plate of food on the table. "I figured you'd be too tired to cook," she said, offering him a small smile. Elijah sighed, stepping closer and wrapping his arms around her. "I don't deserve you." She chuckled softly. "You really don't." They sat together, eating in comfortable silence until Naomi finally asked, "You want to talk about it?" He hesitated before answering. "A donor pulled out today. Because of me." Naomi's expression darkened. "What? Why?" "Because of the whole situation on the plane. Someone didn't like the attention it brought. Said it was controversial to have me as part of the team." Naomi shook her head, disgusted. "That's ridiculous." "Yeah, well, it's not the first time someone's tried to push me out of a space they don't think I belong in." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You're not going anywhere, Elijah. You belong there. And they're not going to break you." Elijah nodded, though the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. "I just don't know how to fix this." Naomi smiled gently. "You don't have to fix it alone." The words settled something deep inside him. He wasn't alone. He had people in his corner, his wife, Benjamin, the veterans he was working with. And if there was one thing he had learned from his time in the military, it was that you never left your team behind. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about everything he had been through since coming home. The battles, the struggles, the unexpected turns. But he also thought about the progress. The lives he was touching. The change he was making, even if it felt small sometimes. And he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this setback define him. Tomorrow, he'd wake up and fight for something better. Elijah woke up before dawn, his mind already racing with plans for the day. The weight of the donor pulling out still sat heavy in his chest, but he refused to let it slow him down. He had spent years fighting battles overseas, and this? This was just another fight, one he couldn't afford to lose. Naomi was still asleep beside him, her breathing even. He took a moment to watch her, to remind himself why he was doing all this. Everything he did was for his family, for the people who had supported him through the toughest times. Carefully, he slid out of bed, grabbing his phone from the nightstand as he made his way to the kitchen. As he sipped on his coffee, he scrolled through his messages. A few were from veterans he had been working with, checking in on their progress. Another was from Benjamin. "I've been thinking. We don't need them. Let's talk later." Elijah smirked, shaking his head. Benjamin never backed down from a challenge. And he was right, they didn't need the donor. They just needed to find another way. By the time Elijah arrived at the office, Benjamin was already there, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed. "Glad you're here," Benjamin said. "I've got an idea." Elijah set his bag down. "Let's hear it." Benjamin tossed a folder onto the desk. "What if we go straight to the people? Crowdfunding, social media campaigns, grassroots support." The organization was never built on corporate donors anyway, it was built on people who care. People who want to make a difference. Elijah flipped through the folder, taking in the details Benjamin had mapped out. It was ambitious, but it had potential. "You really think this could work?" he asked. Benjamin grinned. "I know it can. And I think you should be the face of it." Elijah stiffened. "Me? You're the reason people started paying attention in the first place. That video of you on the plane, the way you handled yourself, it struck a chord with people. If we can channel that into something meaningful, we can raise more than we ever would have gotten from that donor." Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight. But if this was the way to get things done, if this was how they kept the organization going, he was willing to do it. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." They got to work immediately, brainstorming ideas, crafting a campaign that would highlight not just Elijah's story, but the stories of the veterans they were helping. By the afternoon, they had a solid plan in place. Benjamin called in their media team to start filming, while Elijah prepared a speech for their first promotional video. As the cameras rolled, Elijah sat in front of a simple backdrop, speaking directly into the lens. "When I came home from deployment, I thought the hardest part was over," he began. "But the truth is, the fight doesn't end when you take off the uniform. There are so many veterans out there struggling to find jobs, struggling to find a place where they belong. That's why we do what we do. And we need your help." The words came naturally. He wasn't reading from a script, he was speaking from experience. He talked about the work they had been doing, the impact they had made, and the future they were fighting for. When the filming wrapped up, Benjamin clapped him on the back. "That was perfect," he said. "People are going to listen." They launched the campaign that evening, pushing it across every platform they had. Within hours, donations started trickling in. Small amounts at first, but steady. And then, as the video gained traction, the numbers climbed. Comments flooded in, messages of support, people sharing their own stories, others calling out the donor who had pulled out. By the next morning, it had gone viral. Elijah sat at his desk, staring at the numbers on the screen. "I can't believe this," he muttered. Benjamin leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Believe it. People care, Elijah. They just needed someone to show them why." The media caught on quickly. News outlets started reaching out, asking for interviews. Elijah turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in making this about himself. But when a major network requested an in-depth segment on the organization, he agreed. The interview was scheduled for later that week. As the day approached, Naomi noticed how tense he had become. "You okay?" she asked one night as they lay in bed. Elijah sighed. "I just don't like all this attention." She turned to face him, resting a hand on his chest. "I know. But think about what you're doing. You're making a difference." He nodded, exhaling slowly. "I just don't want this to be about me. It's about all of us." She smiled. "Then make sure that's what you say." When the interview day arrived, Elijah found himself sitting across from a well-known journalist, cameras focused on him. The interview started with the expected questions, about his service, about the incident on the plane. But then she asked something that caught him off guard. "How did that moment change you?" Elijah thought about it for a long moment before answering. "It didn't change me," he said finally. "It reminded me of what I already knew, that there's still work to be done. That people like me still have to prove we belong in places we've earned. But it also reminded me of something else, that we're not alone. That there are people out there who care, who want to help. And that's what this is about." The response resonated. The interview aired that night, and within hours, their campaign hit its goal, and then exceeded it. More veterans reached out, asking how they could be part of the movement. More donors stepped forward, wanting to help. What had started as a setback had turned into something bigger than any of them had imagined. A few days later, Elijah sat in his office, scrolling through messages of support. One in particular caught his eye, a message from someone unexpected. "I owe you an apology." It was from Lisa. He stared at the screen for a long time before clicking on the message. "I watched your interview. I saw what you've done since that day. I never thought about what my words really meant until I saw the way people responded to you. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." Elijah let out a slow breath. He had spent weeks trying to push that moment out of his mind, trying not to let it define him. And now, here she was, acknowledging what she had done. He didn't know if he wanted to respond. But after a moment, he typed back. "I appreciate that. I hope this experience has taught you something." A few minutes later, she responded. "It has." Elijah didn't need anything more than that. He closed his laptop, exhaling. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, challenging, exhausting, but also meaningful. He had stepped into a role he never expected, and now, he had no intention of stopping. Benjamin knocked on the door. "We've got a meeting with a new donor," he said. Elijah nodded. "Let's go." He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. And he was ready for whatever came next. Elijah sat at the long conference table, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood as he listened to the discussion around him. The new donor, Richard Lawson, was a polished businessman in his early 50s, his suit immaculate, his voice calm and composed. He had been following the campaign closely, impressed by how quickly it had gained traction, and now he wanted to be involved. "I respect what you're doing," Richard said, folding his hands in front of him. "It's important work, and it's long overdue. I want to support it, but I also want to understand how my contribution will be used." Elijah exchanged a glance with Benjamin, who gave a slight nod before leaning forward. "We believe in transparency," Benjamin said. "Every dollar we receive goes directly toward veteran support programs, mental health services, job training, housing assistance. We're not here to make a profit. We're here to make a difference." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That's good to hear. But I want to do more than just donate. I want to be involved in an active way." Elijah sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" "I own a chain of manufacturing plants across the country," Richard explained. "We're always looking for skilled workers. Many of your veterans already have the discipline and technical knowledge we need, they just lack the formal training. If you're willing to collaborate, I'd like to create a program where we provide that training and guarantee them jobs." Elijah blinked in surprise. This was more than they had hoped for. Money was essential, but real opportunities, real, sustainable jobs, were what these veterans needed most. "That would change lives," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "If we can work out the logistics, I think this could be exactly what we've been working toward." Richard smiled. "Then let's make it happen." By the time the meeting wrapped up, Elijah felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They had fought hard to keep the organization alive, and now, not only were they surviving, they were expanding. As he and Benjamin left the building, stepping into the crisp evening air, Benjamin let out a low whistle. "That was unexpected." Elijah chuckled. "Yeah, but in the best way possible." Benjamin turned serious. "You realize what this means, right? We're not just running a charity anymore. We're about to become something much bigger." Elijah nodded. "I know. And I'm ready for it." The drive home was quiet, and as Elijah pulled into his driveway, he saw Naomi waiting for him on the porch. She was holding 2 cups of tea, a small smile on her face as he walked up the steps. "You're home later than usual," she said, handing him a cup. "Big meeting," he replied, taking a sip. "Looks like we're about to change the game." Naomi studied him for a moment. "You've changed." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the street, the quiet suburban neighborhood they had chosen for their fresh start. "When you came home, you weren't sure what you wanted. You were restless. But now? I see it in your eyes, Elijah. You've found your purpose." Elijah exhaled, staring out into the darkness. "I think you're right," he admitted. "But it's a lot. More than I expected." Naomi reached for his hand. "Then take it one step at a time." The next morning, Elijah met with the team to start planning the logistics of the job training program. Calls were made, meetings were scheduled, and soon, the framework was in place. Veterans would receive specialized training tailored to the industries Richard's company needed, and upon completion, they'd be offered full-time positions. It wasn't just a job, it was a future. But with the growing success came growing attention. A week later, Elijah was in his office when Benjamin knocked on the door, holding up his phone. "You need to see this." Elijah took the phone, frowning as he saw an article flashing across the screen. The headline read, "From Controversy to Influence, the man who took a viral moment and built a movement." He scanned the article, which detailed everything, from the incident on the plane to the viral campaign, to the organization's latest success. It painted him as a symbol of resilience, an unexpected leader in the fight for equality and opportunity. Elijah sighed, setting the phone down. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Benjamin said. "But it's happening whether you want it or not." Before Elijah could respond, his office phone rang. It was a news station, requesting an in-depth feature on the new program. More requests flooded in over the next few days, from interview offers to speaking engagements. Elijah knew he had to be careful. The mission was what mattered, not personal fame. After discussing it with the team, he agreed to one interview, a televised segment that would highlight the real impact of the work they were doing. The day of the interview arrived quickly. The studio was bright, cameras positioned at every angle. Elijah sat across from the journalist, a composed but firm look on his face. "You've come a long way since that moment on the plane," the interviewer said. "Did you ever imagine that moment would lead to all of this?" Elijah shook his head. No. But what I did know is that I wouldn't let it define me. I had a choice: let it make me bitter, or use it to create something meaningful. I chose the latter. The interviewer nodded. And now, your organization is expanding in ways no one expected. Tell us about this new job training program. Elijah explained everything: the partnership with Richard, the veterans they were helping, the opportunities they were creating. And what about Lisa? The interviewer asked suddenly. Have you spoken to her since the incident? Elijah hesitated, then nodded. She reached out. She apologized. Do you forgive her? Elijah took a deep breath. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about growth. If she's truly learned from this, if she's willing to change, then yes, I can forgive. The interview ended on a powerful note, and as soon as it aired, the public response was overwhelming. Donations spiked again. More companies reached out, wanting to replicate the job program in their own industries. Elijah found himself at the center of something bigger than he had ever imagined. Later that evening, he sat on the couch with Naomi, watching their daughter play on the floor. You did good today, Naomi said softly. Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. It still feels strange. You don't have to like the attention, she said. But if it helps more people, isn't it worth it? Elijah nodded slowly. Yeah, it is. Benjamin called a few minutes later. You're not going to believe this. What now? Elijah asked. The governor's office just reached out. They want to talk about statewide funding for veteran job training. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. This was bigger than anything he had ever planned. But maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where he was meant to be. Elijah sat in his office, staring at the email on his screen. The governor's office had officially requested a meeting to discuss statewide funding for their job training program. It was a milestone he hadn't anticipated so soon, and the weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew this was an opportunity to take everything they had built to the next level, but it also meant navigating the political landscape, something he had never particularly enjoyed. Benjamin entered the room, leaning against the doorframe with a smirk. So, you gonna sit there all day staring at that email, or are we actually gonna make history? Elijah sighed, rubbing his temple. It's a lot, Ben. This isn't just expanding the program. If we get the state involved, it becomes something entirely different. Benjamin stepped forward, dropping into the chair across from him. And that's a bad thing because... Elijah hesitated. Because it means more bureaucracy, more red tape, and more people trying to control what we built. Benjamin studied him for a moment before shaking his head. Look, I get it. You've been in situations where people in power didn't always have your best interests at heart. But this? This is your shot to make an impact on a level we never dreamed of. We're talking about funding that could help thousands of veterans and families. Elijah exhaled slowly. He knew Benjamin was right. This wasn't about his personal discomfort, it was about the people they were trying to help. He clicked the email, responding with a confirmation for the meeting. All right, he said, leaning back in his chair. Let's make history. A week later, Elijah and Benjamin arrived at the state capitol, their suits crisp, their nerves hidden behind steady expressions. They were ushered into a sleek conference room, where a team of officials, including Governor Warren himself, sat waiting. The governor was a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes that studied them carefully as they took their seats. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Cole, I've been following your work closely, he said. What you've done in such a short time is nothing short of remarkable. Elijah nodded. Thank you, sir. But there's still a lot more to do. Governor Warren smiled slightly. That's why you're here. We believe your program has the potential to be implemented statewide. We want to discuss what that would look like. Elijah and Benjamin spent the next hour breaking down their proposal, how the job training would function on a larger scale, how funding would be allocated, and how veterans and marginalized communities would benefit. The officials listened intently, nodding in agreement at several points. When Elijah finished speaking, the governor leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. I won't lie to you. Expanding this statewide is going to take time. There will be opposition, pushback from certain groups who think we're giving out handouts. He rolled his eyes at the term. But I believe in what you're doing. If you're willing to work with us, we can make this happen. Elijah exchanged a glance with Benjamin, who gave a slight nod. This was it. The moment they had worked for. "We're in," Elijah said. The meeting ended on a strong note, with promises of continued discussions and next steps. As they walked out of the building, Benjamin let out a low whistle. "I can't believe we just sat in a room with the governor and made a deal." Elijah chuckled. "Yeah. Feels surreal." They celebrated that night with their team, the energy in the air electric. But even with the excitement, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, something he hadn't prepared for. A few days later, Naomi walked into the house, her expression unreadable. Elijah looked up from his laptop. "What's wrong?" She hesitated before handing him her phone. "You need to see this." Elijah's stomach tightened as he took the phone, scanning the news headline. "Lisa Marshall speaks out, former executive claims public shaming ruined her life." His jaw clenched as he read the article. Lisa, the woman from the plane, had resurfaced, doing an exclusive interview where she painted herself as a victim. She claimed that the public backlash had destroyed her career, that she had received death threats, and that she had been unfairly labeled as a racist. Elijah exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable." Naomi sat down beside him. "She's framing it as if she was the one wronged. And now, some people are starting to shift the conversation. They're saying she deserves a second chance." Elijah ran a hand down his face. He had expected Lisa to try and re-enter the public eye eventually, but not like this. Not by twisting the narrative. Benjamin called a few minutes later, his voice tense. "We need to get ahead of this. Some conservative outlets are already running with her side of the story, saying this was cancel culture, gone too far." Elijah took a deep breath. "I'm not going to play into that. We've stayed focused on our mission, and that's not changing." "I hear you, man," Benjamin said. "But this isn't going away. You need to decide how you want to handle it." That night, Elijah wrestled with the decision. Part of him wanted to ignore Lisa entirely, to keep doing the work and let the noise die down. But another part of him knew that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. The next morning, he called for a press statement. Standing in front of the cameras, he kept his voice steady. "I've seen the recent discussions regarding Lisa Marshall. I understand that people believe in redemption and second chances. I do too. But redemption requires accountability. Growth requires acknowledgement of harm. Ms. Marshall never reached out to me directly. She never took responsibility for her words or actions that day. Instead, she waited until public opinion shifted before speaking. That is not accountability." He let his words settle before continuing. "We did not start this movement out of anger. We started it to create real change. And real change means focusing on solutions, not distractions." The statement went viral within minutes. While some still pushed Lisa's narrative, the overwhelming majority stood by Elijah. Lisa herself remained silent after that, and soon, the media moved on. 2 weeks later, Elijah was in his office when he received an unexpected visitor. Naomi led a young man inside, a nervous college student clutching a notepad. "Elijah," Naomi said gently. "This is Jordan. He's the one who recorded that video on the plane." Elijah looked up in surprise. The young man shifted uncomfortably. I just wanted to meet you," Jordan said. "I never imagined that video would change so much. I recorded it because I knew what she was doing was wrong. But I never expected it to lead to all of this." Elijah studied him for a moment before nodding. "You saw something and took action. That matters." Jordan hesitated. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if it made things harder for you." Elijah smiled slightly. "You don't have to apologize. The truth needed to be seen." Jordan nodded, relief washing over his face. "Thank you. For everything." As he left, Elijah sat back in his chair, exhaling. He had come full circle, from being a man caught in an unfair moment to leading a movement that was changing lives. And he wasn't done yet. Elijah sat in the dimly lit office, the hum of the city outside barely audible as he flipped through a stack of reports. The expansion of the job training program was going well, better than he had even anticipated, but there were still obstacles. Bureaucratic delays, funding approvals that moved at a snail's pace, and political pushback from groups who saw their work as an overreach. Benjamin walked in, dropping a manila folder onto the desk with a low whistle. "The numbers from the last quarter. We're making progress, but we're gonna need more funding if we want to keep up with demand." Elijah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I figured as much. Benjamin took a seat across from him, his expression unreadable. "You okay, man? You've been running at full speed since the governor's meeting. Haven't seen you slow down once." Elijah exhaled, setting the papers down. "I just keep thinking, we started this as a small initiative. Now, it's growing into something I never expected. And with that comes all these extra layers of politics, bureaucracy. I don't want to lose sight of why we started in the first place." Benjamin nodded slowly. "I get it. But you gotta trust that we're still on the right path. We can't help people if we don't play the game a little." Elijah hated that he was right. The system was flawed, and sometimes, to change it, you had to work within it. But that didn't mean it sat well with him. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Naomi stepped in, holding her phone in her hand, a look of mild irritation on her face. "You're not going to believe this," she said, handing Elijah the phone. On the screen was a news article with a familiar name in the headline. "Lisa Marshall speaks again, the high price of a mistake." Elijah's stomach tightened. "What now?" Naomi sat on the edge of the desk. She's been doing these small interviews, nothing major, but enough to stay relevant. She's spinning the whole situation, saying she's changed, and that people shouldn't be defined by a single moment. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Has she reached out to us?" Naomi shook her head. "Nope. But she's making it sound like she has. She keeps using vague language, saying she's working toward understanding and hoping to make amends. But as far as I can tell, she hasn't done a thing." Benjamin leaned back in his chair with a groan. "Man, she's trying to rehabilitate her image without actually doing the work." Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. If she was serious about accountability, she would have reached out. She wouldn't be going on some PR tour to fix her reputation. Naomi nodded. "I agree. But the public loves a redemption story. Some people are already starting to say she's been through enough." Benjamin scoffed. "Been through enough? She lost her job because of her own actions. Meanwhile, you were just trying to get home to your family." Elijah rubbed his temples, thinking. He didn't want to get dragged back into a public back and forth with Lisa. That wasn't the mission. He had spent too much time building something real to let this become another distraction. "So what do we do?" Naomi asked. Elijah looked up. "Nothing." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Nothing?" "She wants attention. She wants us to respond, to engage with her narrative. If we do, it just gives her more airtime. We focus on our work. We let our actions speak for themselves." Naomi smiled. "That's the right call." Benjamin nodded, though he still looked frustrated. "I just hate that she gets to manipulate the situation." Elijah stood, stretching. "She can say whatever she wants. But at the end of the day, the truth is out there. People saw what happened. And the work we're doing speaks louder than anything she can say in an interview." The conversation ended there, but the thought lingered in the back of Elijah's mind. He hoped Lisa would eventually fade into obscurity, but he knew the world didn't always work like that. Underscore 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 underscore. A week later, Elijah was preparing for a fundraising gala, an event meant to secure more funding for their expanding programs. Naomi fussed over his tie, adjusting it while he stood still, mildly amused. "You look fine," he assured her. "You looked fine 5 minutes ago, but now you look great," she teased. He kissed her forehead before grabbing his jacket. "You're the best." "I know," she replied with a smirk. At the gala, the energy was electric. Major donors, corporate partners, and public figures filled the room, mingling and discussing the future of their initiatives. Elijah and Benjamin moved through the crowd, shaking hands and making introductions. Then, midway through the evening, Naomi approached him with a curious look. "Elijah, you're not going to believe who's here." He followed her gaze toward the entrance, and his stomach clenched. Lisa Marshall stood near the doorway, dressed elegantly but looking out of place, her expression hesitant. Elijah took a deep breath. "I'm not doing this tonight." Naomi touched his arm. "I don't think she's here for a scene. She came alone." Benjamin joined them, his expression darkening when he saw Lisa. What the hell is she doing here? Lisa seemed to hesitate before making her way toward them. When she reached them, she looked at Elijah directly, something in her demeanor different from before. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. Elijah crossed his arms. "I don't think we have anything to talk about." Lisa swallowed, glancing at Naomi and Benjamin before looking back at him. "Please." Elijah considered it. He could easily dismiss her, tell her to leave, let her deal with the consequences of her actions alone. But something in him told him to hear her out. "Fine," he said. 5 minutes. They stepped aside into a quieter corner of the venue. Lisa took a deep breath before speaking. "I know I've handled everything badly," she admitted. "I was defensive, I was angry, and I didn't want to admit that I was the villain in that situation. But the past year has made me realize a lot." Elijah remained silent, waiting. Lisa looked down briefly before meeting his gaze again. "I lost my job, my reputation, but more than that, I lost my sense of who I thought I was. I always believed I was a good person, that I wasn't racist, that I was fair. But when I looked back at what I did, I realized that I treated you like you didn't belong. And that's something I have to live with." Elijah studied her. "So why are you here?" Lisa hesitated before answering. "I want to help. Not for PR, not to fix my reputation, but because I've spent so much time reflecting and realizing how deep my biases were. I don't want to just apologize. I want to be part of the solution." Elijah sighed. "You don't just get to say you've changed. Change is action, not words." Lisa nodded. "I know. And I don't expect you to trust me. But I'd like to start somewhere." Elijah wasn't sure what to make of her words. But one thing was clear, this was the first time she had spoken to him without arrogance or condescension. "I'll think about it," he finally said. Lisa nodded, looking relieved. "That's all I ask." As she left, Elijah turned back to Naomi and Benjamin. "Well?" Benjamin asked. Elijah exhaled. "I don't know. But if she's serious, we'll find out soon enough." Elijah stood at the podium, the warm lights of the gala casting a soft glow over the sea of faces before him. He had been in rooms like this before, filled with influential people eager to support causes that made them feel good. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was an undeniable energy in the air, a sense that change wasn't just being talked about, it was happening. He cleared his throat, his fingers grazing the edges of the note cards in front of him, though he knew he wouldn't use them. He had never been one for rehearsed speeches. He preferred to speak from the heart. "When we started this initiative, we didn't expect it to grow into what it is today. We didn't expect the outpouring of support, the lives that would be changed, or the stories that would unfold. But here we are. And that's because of people like you, people who believe that a better world isn't just possible, it's necessary." The audience was silent, hanging on to his every word. He could see Naomi in the front row, her expression proud, her hands clasped together as she listened. Beside her, Benjamin nodded in approval. "But real change," Elijah continued, "doesn't happen in rooms like this. It happens in the moments when no one is watching. It happens when we choose to listen, when we choose to confront our biases, when we choose to stand up instead of looking away." He scanned the crowd and, for the briefest moment, his eyes landed on Lisa. She had taken a seat in the back, away from the prominent guests, almost as if she was unsure whether she truly belonged there. "This work," Elijah went on, "isn't about saving people. It's about creating opportunities for people to save themselves. It's about giving people the tools, the access, the chance to build something better for themselves and their communities. That's why we're here." A round of applause broke out, and as Elijah stepped down from the podium, he felt a weight lift from his chest. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but he understood now that sometimes, the best way to create change was to step forward and use your voice. As the gala continued, he made his way through the room, shaking hands with donors, answering questions from curious attendees, and discussing future plans with potential partners. Naomi stayed close, handling the logistics with her usual efficiency, while Benjamin worked the room with his charm, securing commitments from people who had the power to make a real difference. Then, just as he was about to step outside for a breath of fresh air, Lisa appeared in front of him. "Elijah," she said, her voice hesitant. He met her gaze, unreadable. "Lisa," she exhaled. "I just wanted to say, that was a powerful speech." He nodded. Thanks. She fidgeted with the strap of her purse, clearly nervous. I meant what I said before. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to do the work. I want to learn. Elijah studied her for a long moment. He had heard people say things like this before, people who wanted redemption for themselves rather than true understanding. But something about Lisa's posture, her tone, told him she was sincere. You want to learn? He asked finally. She nodded. Then show up, he said simply. Not for me. Not for some PR stunt. But for the people who actually need to see that change is possible. Lisa swallowed, nodding again. I will. He didn't offer her a smile or words of encouragement. He had learned that true change wasn't about easy words, it was about action. If Lisa was serious, she would prove it. As she walked away, Naomi approached, raising an eyebrow. That looked intense. Elijah sighed. She wants to help. Naomi crossed her arms. Do you believe her? I don't know, he admitted. But I believe people can change if they actually want to. Naomi nodded. Guess we'll see. The night continued, and when it finally ended, Elijah found himself sitting in his office, the city lights glowing beyond the window. The sound of the gala had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the world outside. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This work wasn't easy. It never had been. But it was necessary. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Benjamin stepped inside, tossing a folder onto his desk. Just got the final numbers from tonight. We raised enough to fund the expansion for at least another year. Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's incredible. Benjamin grinned. Told you we were on the right track. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. You're never gonna let me forget that, are you? Not a chance. They sat in silence for a moment before Benjamin spoke again, his tone more serious. You think Lisa's really gonna follow through? Elijah sighed. I think she's realizing that change isn't about saying the right things. It's about actually doing them. If she's serious, she'll find a way to show it. Benjamin nodded. And if she's not? Elijah shrugged. Then that's on her. We keep moving forward. Benjamin smiled, leaning back in his chair. You know, for a guy who didn't want to be in the spotlight, you're doing a damn good job leading this thing. Elijah smirked. Don't remind me. As the city pulsed outside, as the weight of the night settled in, Elijah allowed himself a moment of peace. He thought about how far they had come, how much more there was to do. And he knew, no matter what challenges lay ahead, no matter what obstacles they faced, they were on the right path. The work wasn't finished. But they were just getting started.